Flies circled his open mouth like priestesses of the end. Blood flowed no longer as a symbol of life, but as liquid heresy, spurting from his eyes, his fingernails, his guts. The royal purple, once shining like the robes of the gods, was now drenched in a viscous red that smelled of rust and humiliation. He trembled, not from the cold, but from an ancestral terror, as if his body finally heard the screams he had silenced throughout his entire life. They called him enlightened, anointed, son of promise. From the cradle he carried invisible crowns on his head and hidden curses in his womb. He was beautiful like an ancient statue, merciless like time. He ruled with his eyes fixed on the horizon, where he saw not lands, but destiny. And yet, even when blessed by prophets and desired by crowds, there was a strange silence in him, the omen of something the world dared not name. That light that shone on his forehead always shone a little beyond what was acceptable, like a blade under the skin. It was a time of crusades and plagues, of blind monks and mad knights. Faith was sword and chain. The people fasted for salvation, but died of hunger and superstition. Kings were demigods, and their downfalls moral earthquakes. The cathedral bells did not just call people to Mass, they announced omens. And the throne on which he sat seemed made not of gold, but of sacrificed flesh. Nothing was light, nothing was pure. Everything smelled of incense, iron, and sin. This is not just the story of one man. It is the story of all who dared to desire the absolute, of all who confused power with eternity, and hearts with instruments of war. Here we speak of pride and madness, of vanity and penance, of a body that groaned in blood not from illness, but from an excess of glory. This king was not a victim, he was an altar and an offering. It is said that on his last night he wept tears so red that they stained the ground like a prophecy fulfilled. And then he whispered something inaudible, as if asking forgiveness not from heaven, but from his own flesh. What lies hidden in the hearts of great men is always what destroys them.
From his first days on the throne, there was an unbearable gleam in his eyes, not divine light, but fever. The people hailed him as a visionary, but all he saw were reflections of himself in everything, in wars, in prayers, in wine. His soul was an open wound in the shape of a crown, pulsing beneath the golden robes that hid the emptiness. He loved to be adored, not because he was loved, but because he feared the shadow of oblivion. The nights were long and restless. He muttered prophecies that no one understood, scribbled maps that led nowhere. His heart demanded the impossible, eternity, perfection, the absolute surrender of all to his will. He did not admit failure, not even from the stars, and when they did not respond, he blamed the gods themselves. Little by little, he replaced the altar with his image in the mirror. He ordered fasts so that heaven would not forget him, but he feasted on rare meat like a sacred predator. He preached virtue to the people, but collected the skulls of advisors who dared to disagree. Each victory was more bitter than the last, for no conquest could fill the abyss that grew in his chest. He ruled like one who pretends to pray, with firm lips, but his soul in exile. His obsession with purity led him to purge even the most loyal. He called it divine justice, but it was fear in disguise, fear of being betrayed, forgotten, supplanted. The king would not admit imperfections, not even in his own flesh, and began to mutilate himself in secret, seeking to remove the error. His skin was a battlefield between holiness and despair. With each new decree, more rigid, more cruel, he tried to ward off the chaos that whispered in his mind. But chaos had already taken residence, in his bones, in his breath, in the dreams where he saw his own body rotting under the throne. He called these dreams prophetic visions, but they were warnings. The throne was already beginning to devour him. Still, the people cheered him on, and that intoxicated him. Adulation was the drug that fed his delusions of immortality. Poets composed hymns to his glory, but the old men whispered that the king was no longer a man, he was a curse. The living legend began to stiffen like a statue doomed to ruin. He believed he was the chosen one, but deep down he feared he was just another man. It was this fear that made him cruel, not to others, but to his own destiny. He would never admit that his greatness was made of fear, not faith. Pride, dressed in purple, began to ferment. The first tear of blood fell in the solitude of a starless dawn. He smiled, thinking it was a miracle. It was only the beginning.
Everything changed when the Empress fell ill and the doctors fell silent. She was his only voice of calm, his anchor in reality. Without her, the palace corridors grew colder, and the walls seemed to listen. The people begged for mercy, but the king decreed days of silence, not for mourning, but for anger. Her death was the spark that ignited a rain that was already burning inside. Then came the betrayals. A general fled with half the army. A bishop revealed secrets that compromised the king's divinity. There were revolts in the fields, fires in the name of hunger. But he denied everything. He ordered the messengers to be crucified and the letters burned. He said it was all a trial. God was testing him. The truth is that madness had already entered the gates. The nights became infested with voices, voices without bodies, without faces, without forgiveness. He stopped sleeping and began to wander through the halls murmuring incoherent prayers. The mirror in his bedroom was covered with a black cloth. He said the reflection cursed him. There was no longer a throne to sit on, only an altar to bleed on. An eclipse stained the sky. The people hid. He, dressed in white like a poisoned lamb, climbed onto the rooftops and shouted that he was the chosen one. Some wept, others fled. Those closest to him began to conspire. The sacred majesty was now a threat. The kingdom itself, once on its knees, began to clench its fists. The altars fell, the temples were looted. A group of nobles tried to poison him, but he survived. He began to eat only what he hunted himself. The royal gardens became slaughterhouses. The smell of blood lingered on his hands and clothes. There was something animalistic in his gaze, a mixture of fury and abandonment. The people began to call him the Red King, not because of his clothes, but because of the stains that followed him wherever he went. The ground he walked on was no longer sacred, it was contaminated. Even the dogs refused to lie down in his shadow. The palace became a living mausoleum, and its corridors of a gold-adorned asylum. Even so, he tried to pray, but the words would not come out. Only moans, only screams, only blood. Gathered with the few faithful, he began to perform macabre ceremonies where he offered himself as savior and martyr. The people no longer saw him as king. They saw him as punishment incarnate. The drum of tragedy beat ever louder, but he, blinded by pride and pain, still danced. Each step a denial, each sigh a refusal to fall.
One night, isolated among mold-covered tapestries, he looked at himself in the waters of a basin. The face he saw was not his own. It was a living skull, with red eyes and tattered skin. He knelt down, not out of humility, but out of exhaustion. His body no longer obeyed him. His knees were swollen. His fingers were stiff. Blood flowed without warning from his nostrils, his ears, his words. The servants avoided touching him. They said his skin burned like burning coal. One of them, while cleaning the stained floor, fainted from the smell, something between myrrh, fever, and rot. The king just watched, silently, and muttered, "I have become what I feared, but I was worshipped for it." The walls whispered memories, the voices of childhood, the laughter of the empress, the advice of the elders. Everything sounded distant, ghostly, like a choir of ghosts mocking his glory. He cried silently, but the tears burned, cut. Sometimes they came out thick, dark, almost black. His body was a reliquary of punishments. He began to talk to the dead. He called out the names of those he had executed. He begged for forgiveness with the voice of a man who no longer expected redemption. His eyes, swollen and bloody, stared at the sky without a sky. "Where is God now that my flesh is a desecrated altar?" he said, spitting blood. In his last hearings, the few who visited him said they did not recognize the king. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his mouth repeated a single name, that of his mother, dead for decades. His throne was covered with white cloths. He no longer sat, he crawled. Even so, inside him, something resisted, a remnant of greatness, perhaps pride, perhaps pain, perhaps just the last glimmer of a man who dared to want everything. But there was no one left to hear him, only the rats, the flies, and the echoes of an empire rotting in life. The aura of a king evaporated. All that remained was a naked man, covered in blood, trying to remember who he was. And when he recognized himself, he cried. He cried blood. He cried guilt. He cried until his tears turned to silence. And then he understood that he was not loved. He never was, only feared. And now, not even that.
In the end, his body was a dark offering, swollen, exuding odors that made the flowers in the room wilt in seconds. The servants sewed cloths in the doorways to contain the stench, but death was already everywhere, in the air, on the walls, in the memory. It bled from his pores, his skin cracked like dry soil, and worms emerged from open wounds. He raved, saw angels with broken wings, and crows that spoke with human voices. He tried to scream, but only a liquid rattle came out. Each moan was an aborted prayer. He spent his last days in darkness, surrounded by black candles and prayers that sounded more like spells. A priest was called, but he fled when he saw him. He said there was no soul there, only punishment. The king laughed, or tried to, but the laughter was a grotesque sound, like water gushing from a pierced body. When he finally died, no one knew exactly when. The blood had already dried on the walls. The body looked like a broken statue, sunk in purple sheets as if on a bed of sin. His mouth was open, as if trying to speak his last truth, but no words dared to come out. The bells did not ring. The people did not cry. Only the rats accompanied him to the grave. His name was crossed out of the books. The throne melted, the crown buried with the corpse, as if the world itself tried to erase the mistake it once crowned. Thus fell the king who wanted to be God, and he drowned in his own blood. But what if evil did not come from the outside? What if the blood was just what had been pulsing inside him from the beginning? He was found at dawn, motionless, wrapped in purple sheets stiffened by coagulated blood. The body no longer looked human. It was the carcass of something that once dreamed of eternity. His eyes remained open, glassy, staring at a ceiling he himself had ordered painted with heavenly scenes. Now those divine figures seemed to repel him, as if repelling him even in death. He was buried without songs, without a procession, without glory. The coffin, heavy and adorned with black stones, sank into the sacred ground he had desecrated with decrees and executions. No bells rang, no children cried, only the sound of the wind. And even the wind seemed to hesitate when touching his grave. Silence was the only possible tribute. His grave received no name, no inscription. It was as if the world, in belated compassion, was trying to forget the weight of his existence. Strange flowers sprouted from the wordless tombstone, dark purple in color, as if the earth remembered the blood and refused to forget. The priests called it punishment. The peasants called it a curse. History called it consequence. The once glorious palace fell into ruin. The tapestries molded. The stained glass windows cracked like old mirrors. No one wanted to rule from that throne of thorns anymore. The lineage was extinguished in a few years by disease, suicide, despair. They said that the blood of that king carried an invisible burden. Whoever inherited it would be unable to sleep in peace. Children avoided pronouncing his name in their games. Bards exchanged his stories for others, less sad, less real. But the people, in their bones, still felt it. They felt the shadow of that man hovering like smoke without a source. They still whispered it was he who opened the door to madness, the door to destruction. In the end, what remained was not a legacy, but a wound, an absence so present that it shaped the following centuries like an echo. His reign, marked with gold and blood, became a symbol of everything corrupted by divine vanity. He wanted to be eternal, and he succeeded, but not in the way he wanted. It wasn't the poison, nor the fever, nor his enemies. It was the throne. It was the mirror. It was the absence of forgiveness. It was the pride that swelled until it tore his flesh. The crown did not weigh on his head. It weighed on his soul, and in the end, it crushed it. His death was slow because it was not physical. It was the death of the hope of being more than a man. Some say he saw the gods in his final moments. Others swear he heard only his own name, repeated as a condemnation. Perhaps there is no difference. Perhaps the gods and their demons inhabit the same mirror. Perhaps the true punishment is to see oneself with eyes that no longer lie. The faith that guided him was heresy disguised as light. The justice he preached was fear masked as order. And the love he claimed to feel for the people was in truth the silent plea of a boy terrified by his own insignificance. He built empires on the shifting sands of the soul, and he sunk with them. Time did not redeem him. Time swallowed him. His story survives, but not as an example, as a warning. Because every man who confuses his voice with that of God is only hearing the echo of his own abyss, and every throne that demands blood will sooner or later be swallowed by it. Madness did not visit him. He fed it. He cared for it like a gardener cares for poisonous roses. He embellished it, defended it, crowned it with purple, until it blossomed and took everything, including him, including those who followed him, including those who, in silence, allowed it. He was not a victim, nor was he a villain. He was a symbol of the man who tries to possess the eternal without first mastering himself. And he pays the price for wanting to touch the heavens with hands stained with fear. He was not punished by the gods. He was destroyed by what he himself had cultivated. His end did not come from the outside. It sprouted from within like a sacred fungus. Today, the ruins of his kingdom remain untouched, not out of respect, but out of fear. They say that on moonless nights, you can hear a viscous sound coming from the earth, as if someone were still crying inside it. Not tears, but blood, always blood. And let this be remembered. Not every king is great. Not every throne is salvation. And not all blood is sacrifice.